April 1944, Madame, I can offer you some coffee, Oberstleutnant Peter Baumann said in a friendly tone. He emphasized can in such a way that it meant he would prefer if she didn't accept. I know you French love your coffee, which is why I hope you'll accept some tea. You see, what we are calling coffee in these times would not be served to the worst criminals in a Berlin prison. My tea, however, quite and convincingly sincere. He lowered his voice as though anyone would be foolish enough to eavesdrop here in an Abwehr headquarters. My tea comes straight from Harrods. Baumann's French was flawless and distinctly Parisian. To anyone with an ear, it was clear he had spent considerable time in the capital before the war. He stood and pulled open the top drawer of a gray file cabinet from which he took out a tin of Twinings. This he placed on the desk between them. When I say straight, he continued, I mean of course by way of, well, you wouldn't be interested in the details. His guest, Madame Sylvie Guix, sat on a wooden stool. I knew she would have been clutching her handbag if she had been allowed to keep it. She was nervous, appropriately nervous, I thought, but not too much. After all, this was Vichy France. She and Peter were ostensibly allies now. But no sane Frenchwoman truly trusted their occupiers. Mme Guix displayed exactly the correct amount of deference one would be expected to show in the presence of an Abwehr officer. She did not seem to be afraid. Through the small oval glassed opening that appeared as a mirror on her side, I watched her carefully. I could not see her legs or feet, which she might have been shifting or flexing. She should have been afraid. This modest building, which the local German army district had taken over in 1940, sat in the insignificant commune of Saint Vrain, located in the insignificant department of Côtes d'Armor, which was part of the not insignificant French administrative region of Brittany. The interrogation, and it was that, in all politeness, took place in a room that must have once belonged to a solicitor. The walls were lined with ancient wooden bookcases filled with thick leather books of French law. These cases had been moved to make room for a row of file cabinets. The contrast between the beautiful polished amber of the wood and the coldness of the metal said something to me about the clash of the two cultures. Sylvie Guix was a seamstress from Droux, a humble community about 40 kilometers west of Paris and 300 kilometers from where she sat. This was what her travel documents said, the documents taken from her when she was detained that morning. Her explanation for being so far from home was that she was searching for her brother. Gabriel Guix lived in Brest. The last he had communicated with his family was 4 months ago. Now his mother lay dying, and Sylvie was determined to find him and bring him home. She had made the journey by train and truck. The last few miles she had ridden a bicycle, which she admitted she borrowed without permission from in front of a café in Medriac. The guilt over a minor, forgivable infraction could be stretched to believably cover other trespasses. I thought Mme Guix was clever to shield herself that way. Less experienced questioners would probably fall for it. She was dressed in traveler's attire. A cloak, sturdy shoes, a cloth covering her head. Oberstleutnant Peter Baumann busied himself as promised preparing 2 cups of tea using a kettle on top of one of the filing cabinets. He whistled something, I think it was Wagner, as he placed the cups on the desk. With indifference, he brought out from one of the desk drawers a large covered bowl and a spoon, as though having sugar for your tea, let alone tea, was the most normal thing in these times. She had been trained that trying very hard not to give yourself away often gave you away. Emmy did not blink. She might have blinked. Any citizen of France would be shocked at the sight of so much sweetness in these times. One should excuse her. Peter's smooth distraction of a tea ceremony had captivated her. He was very good at extracting information from his subjects, even when they were not aware that they were disclosing anything, or even that they were being questioned. As they sipped their tea, Baumann looked out the large window that showed the late afternoon sun and the empty main street of the small community. A most pleasant day, he said amicably. She nodded. I apologize for having you stopped. This is ideal weather to be cycling. I saw. She noticed the phrase having you stopped. The teacup paused ever so slightly on its path back to the table. I examined your documents. She drank without spilling a drop. I admired her commitment to the role. And I have good news, he continued. Your brother has been detained nearby by the local authorities, just for questioning. I am sure there is some error which we may clear up with your cooperation. She slowly nodded in cautious agreement. Sergeant. The bark startled her, but it would have startled any innocent, authentic Frenchwoman. I entered the room. The true test. Her eyes briefly froze on my face, then slid away. unconcerned about a mere Frenchman, even one who wore the Vichy colors. Unconcerned that she knew I was not a Frenchman. Unconcerned that I should have been hundreds of miles away. Unconcerned that her husband had just appeared. My name is David Voigt. I was until recently a captain in the United States Army. Perhaps I still am. The entirety of the circumstances that brought me to where I am today are still mostly unknown to me. I sensed the Machiavellian manipulations and backroom dealings in my bones, but I was never officially informed of why. Only how and when. So I will use a parallel story for illustration. In 1939, the Luftwaffe began dropping iron cylinders filled with high explosives onto English soil. Most of these bombs exploded, as intended, but some percentage of them failed to detonate. The heavy cylinders were designed with stabilizing fins that caused the bombs to fall conical nose first at high speed and sometimes penetrate the ground to an astounding depth. As devastating as an explosion might be, the damage can be repaired, the debris cleared away. But when a bomb doesn't explode, normal life within 100 meters or more comes to a halt. Barriers are put up. Danger UXB signs warn everyone to stay away. If this happens near a transportation center or an important government or military building, it hinders the war effort. The Home Office's response was to call in the Royal Engineers, the experts in sinking shafts and such, to dig down and expose the bomb. I imagine that there was a moment when some gray-suited civilian casually said to a Royal Engineer, "And while you're down there, why don't you just go ahead and, oh, I don't know, disarm the damn thing?" Thus, another entry was added to the growing list of wartime instances where the wrong people in the wrong place with the wrong tools and training were ordered to do a job. And do it right. Wait, I need to correct myself on the wrong people comment. That is unfair. I took the opportunity for an easy alliteration. The truth is, those engineers had immense courage and determination. I have no doubt that, after complaining and grumbling in their own obscure yet obscene English way, they went out and disarmed live bombs while holding a cup of tea in one hand. Me, sort of the same, replaced bombs with wooden boats. I had been in London for 2 months before Dunkirk. I came as one of the aides to the military attaché in our embassy, which meant that I spent a lot of time doing nothing when I could have been preparing a rifle company. The draft was happening back home, which meant there would soon be an influx of young men joining my army. As a captain, it would be my job to train a couple hundred of these cocky idiots into a cohesive unit that could survive under fire for more than 10 minutes without shooting themselves or each other. The rumor was that there would be so many new men that I would quickly be promoted to major, maybe even lieutenant colonel, and suddenly have a battalion to worry about. I was excited about the possibilities. I loved London. I loved the pubs, the old buildings, the royal this and that. And I loved the girls. The attractive young women who had seen Hollywood movies and adored my accent as much as I adored theirs. But I was still eager to get back to my regular duties leading young men with guns. Good thing I didn't go out and buy oak leaves. That would have been bad luck compared to what actually happened, which was worse luck. August 1940, the day was bright, hot, and humid. Uncommon weather here, I was told. I perspired heavily, but I still felt a chill when I entered the room. Immediately, I stood at attention. Colonel Lee, my immediate superior, was sitting at his desk. He had opened all the windows wide to catch any breeze that would offer relief. He was showing some glossy photograph to the man standing behind him, peering over his shoulder. The man was old, with white hair and a solid build. His ruddy jowls and a nose that had clearly been broken once or twice gave him a distinct appearance. He was dressed in civilian clothes, but it was clear from the way Colonel Lee spoke to him that he held a higher position. Colonel Lee finally looked up and greeted me, but he didn't introduce his guest. That's when I realized this old man had significant authority. Captain Voigt, Lee said, "At ease. Please stay." With that, they both walked past me and out the door. Colonel Lee paused as he passed me and said softly, "Follow your conscience, David." And then they were gone. Before I had the chance to wonder what the hell was happening and if the oppressive heat had made any of us hallucinate, the door opened again and a young woman walked in. But she wasn't just any young woman. Being a man, I had noticed all the women who worked in the entire building. She wasn't one of them. She had long, shiny black hair that had been carefully curled, wide, dark eyes, a slightly flat nose, and lips as red as strawberries. She was adorable, but she looked about 16 years old. Like someone's little sister who had been taken to work. She was wearing a light, cool blue plaid dress made of linen. She filled out the dress quite well. I tried my best not to focus on her figure. in case she turned out to be someone's little sister who outranked me. I waited for her to realize she had likely stumbled into the wrong office looking for the cafeteria when she addressed me. Captain David Voigt. It wasn't a question. She spoke with an accent that I couldn't quite place, and I'm usually good at identifying accents. I theorized that if she had learned Polish or maybe Hungarian and then moved to England as a child and learned English in Liverpool or somewhere similar, that might be close. You grew up in Brooklyn, Maine. Her voice said, indicating that this petite beauty was used to being listened to and taken seriously. That's correct, I replied, even though it hadn't been a question. Your family builds ships. Yes, Mom, I agreed. She made it sound like the Voigt boat yard was churning out battleships instead of skiffs, powered launches, and the occasional motor yacht. Why was I being questioned by a complete stranger? And why was I responding to them? I knew the answer. Both Colonel Lee and the person who outranked us must have allowed this girl in. Woman, whatever. I still couldn't determine her age. She finally smiled. It was a treat. Ice in your soda on a summer day. You're knowledgeable about building and operating small boats on the ocean. Not the way I would have phrased it, but I nodded. Yet you attended West Point, a military college, instead of a naval institution. I did. Was there a question in there? She used English like she had just learned it. She fell silent for a moment. I got the feeling that she expected me to ask her any of my 10,000 questions, but that wouldn't have been polite. And my mother had taught me to use politeness as a weapon. Tell me a joke in French, she demanded. Make it silly. I told her a French adult joke. I heard that one on the playground when I was too young to understand it. It was still funny in French. My interrogator didn't laugh. I resisted the urge to remind her what exactly a kilt was and act out the joke. Then she asked me in German to explain it. Perfect. German. How did I know? My father is German. He came over from Kiel when he was a teenager. Grandpa and Grandma Voigt had 7 children and eventually dozens of grandchildren. When I was at their house, everyone spoke German, all the time. If a young Voigt wanted to stay alive and not die of hunger, he or she asked for sausage, noodles, or a slice of Grandma's chocolate cake with milk. I've been to Hamburg several times over the years, and they can't differentiate my German from the most German of Germans. The French? The other half of my family, my mother's side, is from Quebec. The Gagnon clan is still mostly there, but they travel. Boy, do they travel. They see the Maine coast as an exotic South Seas destination and visit Grandma Gagnon's farm periodically, turning it into a festival. Where again, the wise grandchild learns to come running when they hear the adults cry out poutine. Or meat pies, shepherd's pie, baked beans. With a few adjustments of the odd slang and colloquialism, my French passes for British. And then it hit me. Gosh, I'm slow, but not stupid. Boats, French, German. This woman didn't want me to read last year's report on aircraft production and write a 10-page memo. Nope. Somehow I figured out the situation. Over the next hour or so, she altered my future. In summary, her offer was the path to take if I wanted to start fighting now. If not, she would vanish and this meeting would never have occurred. 6 hours later, I sat at my desk in room 561 of the Cumberland Hotel, typing out a letter of resignation. I was giving up my position as an Army officer, the goal I had pursued for most of my life. Now that I had achieved it, I was throwing it in the trash, all because of a short conversation with a mysterious woman who promised me dangerous work instead of paperwork. I didn't even know her name. I was probably insane for doing this, but I knew it was the right thing to do. And I had to do it. As I sealed my goodbye to the United States Army in an envelope, there was a knock on my door. She walked in as if her name was on the reservation list. The Cumberland didn't allow unaccompanied females above the lobby, but that didn't stop her at all. I noticed the scars. Around her navel, there were ugly, wavy scars. I returned to her face, realizing I had been holding my breath. Those were serious scars. They would have caused extreme bleeding. No one could survive that level of injury. But she stood there calmly. In an instant, I held her in my arms. We'll probably never meet again, David Voigt. But if you ever need me, ask for Chodakowska, she said. Have you ever driven your car down a familiar road in broad daylight and a huge animal jumps out in front of you and you slam on the brakes, swerve, and end up in a ditch full of logs and thorns, and suddenly it feels like the world goes dark and there's no one around to save you? Me neither. But something similar did happen. It looked like a typical English fishing boat. About 25 feet long, cabin in the middle, open in the back. With a specially made, quiet diesel engine with 180 horsepower, it was fast. It was low to the water and practically invisible at night when I pointed it towards the French coast. My tasks were pretty simple. Pick up a passenger, ask them a question. If they gave the right answer, take them back to England. If they tripped up on my question, well, when morning came, I would be back at the dock, cleaning the boat. That went on for a while. Then they decided I should transport passengers and drop them off. Or wait for them. Or accompany them a mile or two inland and complete a to-do list they provided. Whoever they were, they had decided that because I was Canadian through my mother and a member of the Commonwealth, I should have more responsibilities. They thought I should teach my passengers a few skills before dropping them off. Remember the guy who thought he could just show up at the spot where the bomb had exploded, dig a hole, and be home in time for tea and cookies? I was the wrong guy in the wrong place, etc. When we heard the news about Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entering the war, I figured someone in the War Department would remember my file and order me back into active duty. January 1942, she shut the door loudly, startling me. I had been absorbed in drafting a rough schedule for the next training session. My mind tended to wander when I thought about the mistakes we had made and how to use them as lessons to keep the next group alive. Sorry, David, Moira said with a mischievous smile. I couldn't criticize her for it. The damn door stuck. You had to slam it to get it closed. The whole administration building was a bit off kilter, no matter how you looked at it. It had been built by locals and elderly men who were unfit for combat. The entire place we called the campus offices, barracks, training areas, kitchen, cafeteria were leaky, poorly insulated structures that trembled in the slightest breeze. The only sturdy building nearby was the old stone house, the grand house of this small estate. We reserved it for important visitors and special occasions. I returned to my list and scanned the names of the upcoming group that would be gathering here in 2 days. No, I said without looking up. No way. Moira came over to my desk and leaned on it, assuming a Churchillian pose. It seemed like all she needed was a cloud of cigar smoke, although the room was so cold that I could see her breath. The last name on the list had been added with a different typewriter than the ones above it. Moira Haining, no, I said once again. I made the mistake of looking up at her. Moira had red hair that seemed determined to defy any comb, green eyes, freckles, a strong nose, and a wide mouth with charmingly crooked teeth. She was also the best instructor I had. Some time ago, she had expressed her desire to go into the field. I shook my head. And you know why? You only have one reason, she said, and it's not even that good. I actually had 2 reasons. The first one I had expressed to her countless times since her brother was killed in action. She knew too much. It sounds like a line from a detective story, but it was true. She had been my close assistant since a month after I started this place. She had met every agent that came through our school. She had absorbed every detail of our organization. We couldn't let her fall into enemy hands, and she knew it. She still wanted to go. She understood what that could mean, and she assured me that she was prepared to pay the price if it came to that. I believed her, but I didn't want that price to ever be paid. Too much of why I didn't want her to go was due to the second reason, which I had not revealed to her. I loved her. I don't know how it happened. Sometimes she was like my sister, sometimes my daughter, sometimes even my mother. Our relationship was complicated, and working closely together under the constant stress of sending people we came to care about into potentially deadly situations, well, it made it impossible to have a normal man-woman, teacher-student, employer-employee relationship. Pick any one of those. It didn't work. About a month after she arrived, we returned from a training exercise in the hills of East Sussex. We were exhausted and hungry when we received news that 2 of our agents had been captured. I showed her the message, and she sat down looking defeated. I made us some tea, and we sat by our tiny fireplace, sipping and nibbling on biscuits. As we warmed up, we shed layers of clothing. I only need one reason, I said. She dropped it and went off to prepare for the new class. That night, as I was drifting off to sleep, my door creaked open. Moira entered soundlessly. September 1942, today I met the second group to join since Moira parachuted into France. 4 stood before me in what an optimist might describe as a straight line. I didn't care. If these 4 had been under my command in the United States Army, their sergeants would have lost their voices from gently describing their intellect, background, their mother's status in society, and their lack of geometric awareness. Here their line was close enough. The truth was that none of these new recruits would have been allowed to wear Uncle Sam's army uniform. For one thing, 2 of them were female. One of the men was African American, and, well, the other guy might have made it, I had to admit. But at 5'3" and less than 100 pounds with bricks in his backpack and a youthful face, he barely looked like a soldier. If his local recruitment office hadn't met their quota yet, they might have given him a chance to join Uncle Sam for some fun and adventure, which made some sense, because Michelle was actually a soldier. A Jewish kid from Calais who joined the Marines, the French equivalent of the Marines, then escaped capture when his unit was taken by the Germans in 1940, made his way to Palestine, where one of my scouts found him and told him if he could make it to London, he should go into the Barking Maid pub in Fulham and ask for a pint of hams, then drink whatever they gave him and wait at a back table for contact. The other man, Akinala, told us he had been born in Paris to Nigerian Protectorate parents. Akinala, N-M-I-N-L-N, no middle initial, no last name. 10 seconds after meeting him, I knew he was lying to me. I didn't hold it against him. We had released him from Dorchester prison, where lying was a necessary skill for survival. He had other skills as well. He was an expert forger, con artist, safecracker, and fire starter. He was the perfect agent. Doris was a nurse who had been fired for helping along some of her less enthusiastic elderly patients to the final shore. She was a pleasant-looking woman in her mid-30s, fit, smart, and sassy. She had her own strong views on how the world should be run. That had ended her career and landed her in jail. We always kept an eye on new admissions to such places since many of the qualities that make a person a criminal also make them a successful field operative. The last recruit was a younger woman, 25, thin, dark, pale-skinned, and beautiful. My scout network was always on the lookout for beauty. A woman agent who was attractive had one more very powerful tool. We had used a few as bait with good results. However, she hadn't come to us through the scouts. I received a call from someone in the government, someone to whom I owed several favors. He asked me to take in a young woman he had found living on the streets of Bristol. I told him to send her over, and I would give her every chance to impress me. I knew she wouldn't have any previous skills in the areas we were teaching. Parachute jumping, radio maintenance, Morse code, demolitions, general sabotage, hand-to-hand combat, knife skills, forgery, surveillance, evading a tail. You learn many useful things living on the street, but none of the ones on my list. On the other hand, if she turned out to be mentally and physically sound, her lack of military experience made her a good candidate to mold into the type of person my organization needed. We wouldn't have to break her of any bad habits if she hadn't acquired any habits at all. These were the 4. My 5 instructors and I had 12 weeks to teach them all of the above before they were given code names and sent off to the continent, where the Nazis were currently occupying and plotting their next move. 84 days to save them. I should have been given several years, but time wasn't on our side. I shook their hands and introduced myself. I sensed in their handshakes and saw in their faces a range of hidden truths. This group had their secrets. Jane, the woman from the streets, shook my hand firmly. Her hand was soft with no scars and her eyes were clear. If she had really been living on the streets, then I was Roy freaking Rogers. I asked her in French what gave her the audacity to believe that a worthless person like herself deserved to join my special unit. Without any hesitation, she began to tell me her story. She was fluent and skilled in spinning tales. Not a single word of her story came close to the truth. Still, her French implied she was from one of the regions around Lyon, and that was enough for me. I knew she wasn't actually from Lyon, but her accent would fool anyone else. And looking me in the eye while telling me that story was a talent we could use. I raised a hand to stop her, then directed them to their first lesson. Morse code, or, as they would come to call it after several weeks of practice, Morse code. October 1942, the Barking Maid pub in Fulham on High Street resembled many other pubs that existed to serve a pint to hard-working folks after their shifts. No pretending here in this 2-story brick building at the end of a row of apartments. The exterior was dirty from soot and needed repairs. The inside was low, dark, and filled with the lingering smell of hops. I sat at a back table with a pint of brown ale and a folder of coded messages. Yes, coded messages out in the open in a pub where anyone and everyone could see them. Because this was the Barking Maid, one of several special pubs across the country where members of various intelligence organizations could gather and, to a certain extent, relax. The seemingly mild-mannered barman and his regular drunk assistant were on assignment from the Commando Group L Detachment. the kitchen was staffed by 3 sailors from naval intelligence. There were more weapons hidden under the bar and in cabinets than Washington had when he crossed the Delaware. The staff knew all the local customers. When a stranger walked in, they were watched and evaluated until either eliminated as a threat or politely encouraged to find another pub. The politeness wouldn't extend to a second appearance. I finished working on the sheet in front of me. Columns filled with handwritten numbers and letters arranged in groups of 6, with my careful interpretation written underneath based on the correct code pad. The code changed daily, and the encoding key for that day was printed in a small notebook. The pages of the notebooks issued to agents in the field were made from paper that could be eaten or burned in an instant. I read the message again, this time in its entirety. The small network in Cayenne was well established and providing valuable information. The Germans had disrupted their own momentum 2 years ago when the Royal Air Force defeated them, denying them control of the skies over Britain. It seemed that the Nazi war machine only had 2 gears: arrogance and paranoia. The Luftwaffe had expected to quickly defeat the RAAF, but they were mistaken. Now, the Germans were convinced that the British forces were planning an invasion from across the Channel. They were also wrong about this. While the United States had entered the war, most of their attention was focused on the Pacific. The Allied forces available for an assault on the French coast were far from formidable, but the damn Krauts were incapable of gathering or believing useful intelligence. All their reports, observations, and predictions had to fit into the National Socialist ideology, and sticking to ideological tunnels meant that valuable information was lost. We had 3 agents in Cayenne. We called them Whip-Poor Will, Parsley, and Clafoutis. Every time I glanced at the name Clafoutis, I felt regret and fear. You can't effectively run a network if you're personally invested in it. That was one of the many rules I had ignored. Sergeant Turner was putting his 4 charges through close combat drills. It was apparent that Michel had done this before and really only needed some practice to get the rust off. Akinel had strength and agility, but he had been a thief, not a brawler. Doris had the instincts of someone who had restrained her share of unruly and uncooperative patients. These 3 took to Turner's instructions without much problem, but Jane was out of her depth. It was unlikely that she would ever have to use these skills, yet they should be there in reserve. Turner had sacked the Marquess of Queensberry. In his system, there were no rules. This was not a place for gentlemen or gentlewomen. If an agent was backed into a fight, it was a fight to the end, so eyes, throat, knees, and sensitive areas were primary targets. Jane gave herself away within 5 seconds of sparring. A young woman who had really survived living rough out in the crowd would have learned to hit or punch a man in his sensitive areas. Jane initially fought back frantically. Sergeant Turner had no problem controlling her and throwing her to the ground. I watched for a few more minutes before returning to my unending paperwork. After tea, there was a break before evening instructions. I was walking up the path that led past the barracks to the old house when I turned my head and saw a red dot in the shadows. "Good evening," she said. I tipped my cap. "Jane. How are you?" "Sore." Sergeant Turner can be rather strict. She stepped out into the light. It was Indian summer here on this island, where they had no Indians, and she had shed her tunic so that only a flimsy white jersey covered her. She caught me evaluating her skills and smiled knowingly. "Any tips you can give me?" I hoped she meant about unarmed combat. Well, one basic thing to remember comes way before the hand-to-hand part. If you see someone you wish to avoid before they see you, turn and run. Get out of the area. But if you get caught, don't look like you want to flee. Walk right up to them and ask for help or something. Or something? Or something, I said hurriedly. That might work. I observed her training with great interest, and she observed me observing. She was not outstanding in any of the topics, but then again she was not bad at any either. What she did have was intelligence, wit, looks, charm, and a feminine sensuality that she could turn on as needed. These, especially the last, could not be taught. The class was not the best we had ever had, but it was up there. I met with my contacts in Whitehall several times discussing where these graduates might be placed, the last time just a week before they were to be sent off to their postings. I was brooding on this as I drove back to the camp. I was in a terrible mood. The Germans were on the march in Russia. The Japanese were firmly in control of Southeast Asia. Rumors of Nazi secret weapons circulated about. Against these we sent 3-month wonders, armed with not much more than an incredible amount of courage. I stopped in front of our offices and felt a sense of trouble. Sergeant Turner, who was nominally in charge when I was away, stood rigid in front of the door. I saw no other people around. The camp seemed quiet and deserted as I parked the Hillman and stepped out. I closed the door and looked at Turner, who seemed to be ashamed. I had never seen that look on him. "Sorry, sir," he said in his Liverpool accent, his vowels floating above the consonants. "They just came and took her." My instinct was to tell him to relax, but I still wasn't sure if I had authority anymore or even whose service I was under. Her. Nassen. Jane, sir. Only they asked for Lady Anne. Lady Anne Jennings. I hesitated. Lady, didn't you warn them off? This is a restricted camp. How did they get past the guards? Turner stood even straighter. I held back from telling him to stop. It was his way of coping with this mixed-up world he had fallen into. One of them was a general. "Darn idiots," I snapped. "They have no business." I stopped. "Jane? Lady Anne?" Turner nodded sadly. I looked at my watch. The drive back to London would take an hour and more. Longer if I encountered obstacles like sheep, carts, or broken-down vehicles. The sun was very low, and driving in the dark with weak headlights was slow and dangerous. I sighed and got back into the Hillman. I had some talking to do. Idiots. As I drove, I abused the Hillman's transmission, grinding it as hard as I was grinding my teeth. Neither the gearbox nor my teeth were coming out of this encounter looking good. It explained some of her fake story. Streets my rear. She was one of those amateurs, the wannabes, the hobby spies. And she had slipped by me, wasted my time, my team's time, taken up valuable resources. I was going to find the general, General Wilhite. Turner had gotten his name at least. Then I was going to give him a good telling off. If I ran into Jane or Lady whoever along the way, well then, I would get to know what the local upper class tastes like. It wasn't the first time I had run into the dichotomy that underlies much of the war effort in this country. It must have been a remnant from the Great War, where command was often given to those who had done nothing but be born into some titled family. Who your grandmother was counted as much as initiative and capability when you were responsible for the lives of thousands of young Britons. Every army had their stars and their screw-ups, and the US did have certain last names that gave one an advantage, but the English had made it a system. There were at least 3 organizations, and I have to restrain myself when I think of them in the same category as the true professionals, that were started up by individuals or small groups descended from the privileged class and therefore thought that they were chosen by God and King to found and oversee intelligence operations, treating the competent individuals actually doing the work as subordinates. I am not insulting the Special Operations Executive or Naval Intelligence, or the RAF Intelligence Branch or MI6. They are intelligent, superior entities. But the English have a blind spot when it comes to allowing the aristocracy to have any say in intelligence matters. I had a terrible feeling that Wilhite was probably Queen Victoria's great-grandnephew or something like that, and he had decided to play at sabotage. Like encroaching on my territory and sabotaging my work. The sky was pitch black when I pulled up to the unremarkable building where the man who was as much my immediate superior as anyone I had identified yet resided. He handled the paperwork that got me funds, cooperation from the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy, and anything else I needed. The lights were on in his office, and the blackout blinds were drawn. His secretary let me in, greeting me warmly. Her kindly old face belied the fact that since 1938 she had gone about her daily duties with a .380 Webley strapped under her skirt. Just in case. Boyce was behind his desk shuffling through a stack of papers, unlit pipe in mouth like a pacifier. He didn't look up. "Why didn't you just shoot him?" I stopped. Boyce looked like any other government employee, reading mundane letters, signing ineffective documents, but the man knew everyone and everything. Because my guards can hardly see, and one of them is missing a leg, but they're not dumb enough to shoot a general. He finally looked up at me with what might become a smile if nurtured enough. You could have encountered some imbecile who bought a costume from a shop in the West End. Mulligan knew him, served under him in wipers. Boyce nodded. "Next time you have my permission to shoot. Just don't kill him." "Yes, sir." I always address Boyce as sir. It seemed polite, and I had no idea if he held rank or not. Or if I held rank or not. So, sir, it was. I resisted the urge to salute him. If I ever met his wife, I would address her as Ma Am. Based on his stories of domestic life, maybe I would salute her. Is he running his own operations? Messing with my plans? It wasn't beyond the realm of possibility that the general had his own undercover network and suddenly needed a good-looking young French speaker. If so, my security was seriously compromised. We didn't advertise our personnel. But Boyce shook his head and dismissed those concerns. No, he's just a low-ranking officer with fancy braid on his cap. Then why? Who is she? Boyce took the pipe out of his mouth and examined the empty bowl, scraping at its depths with a fingernail. The trainee you had listed as Jane Winston is actually Anne Jennings. Lady Anne Jennings, daughter of the late Duke of Suffolk. Ah, the poor street child. I don't care who she is, I said. We invested 11 weeks in her. My sergeant says she went against her will. I want her back. He pointed the stem of his pipe at me. That pipe was his muse, I swear. You don't read the newspapers? Her father died last Tuesday. So, the late Duke. She was summoned to attend the funeral. I shook my head. Then why didn't she want to go? I have no idea. He said slowly. The late Duke of Suffolk's family home was Monmouth House just north of Salisbury. I pulled out of London at daybreak and arrived at the estate in 5 hours. The place was a huge stone and brick square with virtually none of the quirky flourishes and additions I had seen on other such places. Monmouth looked like the government had constructed it and then abandoned the project. There were neglected gardens in the front. The drive needed regraveling and grading. The lawns were uneven and browned in large spots. The surrounding grounds were equally as needy. It drove home to me what happened to the order of a place when the young and vital were pulled away by war. An elderly man opened the door before I could raise the knocker. He tottered for a moment, looking me over to see if I was a threat to the house and its occupants, as if he could have done anything about it, then asked me what my business was. I need to see Jane Winston. His face was blank. Lady Anne Jennings. He showed a flicker of reaction, then closed the door in my face. I hoped that meant to wait, because I was not leaving. In a surprisingly short time, the door reopened. The ancient functionary motioned for me to follow. The mistress of the house received me in a library. She was seated in front of a fire, looking so calm that I knew she had been expecting me. If not today, then eventually. She did not rise or offer me her hand. She had Jane's features, more mature. Her hair was still a dark black with no gray. She should not have been a widow. Your Grace, I said. David Voigt, she motioned me to sit in an empty chair opposite her. As I did, my escort brought in a tray, teapot and cups. As he poured, we regarded one another. You have come about Anne, I nodded. She gave a quiet sigh and shook her head. I suppose you are her. What? Commanding officer? She pointedly surveyed my civilian clothes. Something like that. I saw in her body, but never in her impassive face, that she was not used to deflection. It annoyed her. Too bad I had only a huge helping of it to offer. Her last name did not buy access to my secrets. You didn't know about her service? I asked. Service? I knew nothing about it, and she has not been so kind as to tell me what she has been up to these last months. As far as I knew, she took a sip of tea, the implication that she had been played the fool. As far as I was informed, she was on an extended visit to New Zealand. Well done, Jane, I thought. Doable and plausible. The Duchess continued, or was she something else now that the titular head was deceased and the title passed to the eldest son? Dowager Duchess? It was the kind of patrician arcana I hated. It was her father, God rest him, who gave her license to participate in your little troupe. With all respect, Ma Am, your daughter is training to fill a role that is vital to the war effort. That's as maybe, she said, but I am rescinding her permission. She is needed here. I glanced about the room in reflexive response to her statement, and she noticed. I could feel her thoughts. Here was 100 years of history and family continuity and responsibility to the bloodline. The temporary upsets of the world beyond did not compare. But needed here. What, to dust these shelves of long unread books? Anne has 2 suitors. One is a captain in the Royal Navy, commanding a ship currently in the Med. The other has just been made a colonel in the Coldstream Guards. He is in Africa. As time permits, they will come on leave and press their case. She will be married to one or the other by next Christmas. She paused. They are both peers. I nodded. What the heck else would they be, to woo the daughter of a duke? And I would lay frightening odds, given the state of Monmouth House and its grounds, that the 2 potential grooms came from families which had managed to retain their wealth. Come down to it, Jane was just another item for sale in the aristocracy shop. a friend to be bought rather than rented, a mare to be bred for heirs. I knew that she knew. Had it been a desire to be somebody rather than something that had pushed her to volunteer for duty with a high mortality rate? The Duchess and the first exchanged niceties of no substance for a while as she tried tangentially to retrieve information from me. As much as she put up a front of not caring, she really did want to know where Jane had been instead of New Zealand and what training I thought so important. I gave nothing away. I heard the front door open and a woman called out. It was so obviously Jane that I had a moment where some connection clicked deep in my brain. How long had I known this person that the tone of her voice had become so familiar? It made me oddly uneasy. Mother, whose car is in the she stopped suddenly, one step into the room. She showed shock, then a bit of fear, then she rushed to me. I stood and embraced her. She whispered into my ear, so softly that no other person in the room heard her. Thank you. The other person in the room stood just inside the doorway for a moment, then strode into the room like he was the master of the house. He extended his hand as Jane let go of me. James Griffiths White, he said. So glad to meet you at last. Anne has been quite passionate in her praise of you. I shook his hand and managed to give Jane a glance that conveyed my displeasure that she had discussed me at all with her friend. Anyway, old chap, if you ever need another willing body, give me a shout. It all sounds quite exciting. This time I gave her a full glare of disapproval. She looked away, her milky white cheeks coloring. James the eager volunteer was a pudgy man with a round face and thinning blonde hair. I pondered the dangers of inbreeding as I looked him over. He struck me as someone who had never had to break a sweat. The last willing body I would have chosen. Her Grace's keen social instincts kicked in. Polite hospitality, or perhaps the sense in the air that I was 2 sentences away from punching James in the head. She rose regally and informed us that dinner would be served directly. We shall not dress for dinner tonight, she intoned. James, would you do me the honor of picking a bottle or two? Something worthy of the event? He bowed, and they left the library together. Event? I said. Jane's eyes were still on the empty doorway. His engagement. I raised an eyebrow. Not to me, David. I felt that. Vertigo of unwarranted familiarity was the closest way I could describe it. She knew what I was thinking and asking from a simple gesture. But her tone said that she would not have been upset if it had been to her. She looked at me, and I knew that she felt our unspoken channel of communication. He's 14th in line for the throne, David. She's a princess. Of the Netherlands. A princess in exile still beat the daughter of an English duke. Jane, as Lady Anne Jennings, could not compete with actual royalty. In London, I had been casual pint-downing buddies with a Hungarian who claimed to be, and actually was, the Prince of Szabolcs. It did not matter that his little kingdom was a flyspeck of ignored real estate and that his father, the king, was in a German prison. It didn't even matter that he himself was just an average-looking fellow with barely enough funds in pocket to buy his own pints, let alone stand anyone else, he claimed, and I did witness enough of these to attest to their truth, that when an Englishwoman found out that he was royalty, their knickers were doomed to drowning. It's a goddamned aphrodisiac, he would say. These English girls. Getting their socks knocked off by a royal fellow is their dream come true. I put my hand on Jane's shoulder and turned her gently to face me. When the funeral is over, she looked down and shook her head. I can't come back. Say no more, I said, and gave my arm to lead her to the dining room. Our organization required no enlistment, no signature, no promises. One cannot have agents who are in place with anything less than total dedication. If Anne chose not to be Jane, there was no way I could or would convince her to return. At dinner, Her Grace drew manners with the straightest of edges, careful to include all in the conversation and give equal attention to each of her guests. She still managed somehow to defer to James as first among equals. Anne engaged me as a guest and a former employer. Her eyes went to James, however, with a longing she just could not hide. No matter how good a liar I had seen her to be, it was clear they were old and very, very good friends. Was Jane spooning her cream of potato soup dreaming of being with the man 14th in line to the royal throne? How far down the queue did the stimulating effect stretch? When the meal was done, I was spent. It had been a long day physically and mentally. I was foggy from fatigue and had not done my brain any good by participating in numerous toasts to James and his new bride and the longevity of England and to the good people of the Netherlands, etc. Overnight accommodation was offered and accepted. I was in no shape to drive on dark roads with blackout headlights. I made my excuses, and the Duchess bid me good night. She directed the old servant to show me to my room, which he did after I retrieved my bag from the Hillman. An assassin with any capability would not hold a candle in front of their eyes when entering a dark room, so I was not especially worried when the door cracked open. The Colt in my lap gave me another reason to feel secure. March 1943, halfway through the next training class, I received an invitation to visit a certain office in Whitehall for a meeting. This was code for discussing important matters regarding funds and resources. The room number signified the meeting location. Tea was often served at these Whitehall gatherings. These meetings were sometimes unproductive, but they did provide me with an excuse to visit shops in London, since the small village closest to our camp didn't offer much. A young and pretty Wren guide led me into the room. Only one person was seated at the table, which wasn't a good sign. The man had a long, thin nose and a small mouth. He was impeccably clean-shaven, possibly unable to grow facial hair. His wire-framed glasses hid his watery blue eyes. Ration seemed to have taken a toll on him. His coat hung loosely on his frame, indicating recent weight loss and a lack of funds to tailor it to his new size. He introduced himself as Mayberry, but I doubted that was his real name. I introduced myself as usual. He seemed surprised by my accent, suggesting he was unprepared for our meeting. On the other hand, I had done my research. I placed my bag down and sat across from him. There are certain strategic operations being planned, he began. His voice and tone tried to sound more important than his appearance would suggest. I suspected he practiced speaking in front of a mirror. He didn't even bother starting with, as you may know or you may have heard. No, he assumed I was just some low-ranking mechanic. Do these operations fall under your department? I asked. He smiled. Something like that. In the event, is your department in charge of these operations? He didn't appreciate the interruption. I didn't catch the name of your department. He was trying to use that you are not privy to this information tactic. That's not important, bingo. I nodded as if understanding, and he continued without realizing the danger. He rambled on while I sat there with a faint smile. In short, he and his unnamed department had been given authority by some higher-ups in the SOE to take over my networks, as soon as communication lines could be transferred, and so on. No, thank you, I declined politely. What? He was taken aback. You? We don't need your permission. All right, but I must reject your offer. He sat there, frozen, his mind struggling to process my response. You don't understand, mister. Voigt, he said at last, trying to salvage his dignity. He hadn't even come close to figuring out my rank. We'll just take them, he said through gritted teeth. It was clear that he was losing control. 2 tiny drops of spit escaped his mouth. This was the epitome of grace under pressure for a professional spy master. And I will signal for them to escape. They will go underground, destroy everything, and go back to safety. Like returning home to their mothers. I'll have your agents arrested if they dare to return. Wow, Mayberry's intelligence was on vacation. I wondered how many days I could shorten the war and how many lives I could save by following this fool into the nearest quiet park and shooting him in the head. Instead, I grabbed my bag, bid him good day, ignoring his attempts to make me sit back down, and left the room. In the hallway, I turned off the battery-powered wire recorder in my bag. Someone unknown to me, but probably well known to Mayberry, would soon have a discreet chat with him. They would explain that threatening to arrest your own agents was a profoundly foolish move that would have severe consequences for his career. May 1943, I thought I would never see Lady Anne Jennings again, so it was no surprise that I found her one afternoon on my cot. She jumped up and hugged me, keeping it modest. She trembled in my arms. Oh, David, it's so great to see you. It's great to see you too, Anne. What brings you here? She stepped back and looked up at me. She flashed her devastating smile. You? You don't owe anything to anyone. Her smile faded. Actually, wait, you do owe me. I tilted my head, like a confused dog. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a stack of Ramsay's prophylactics. Simone had a saying for moments such as these. It roughly translates from the French as a nail does not want to be caressed into the board or something like that. You get the idea. The last time, I couldn't see her at night. Today there was no such problem. This building may have been hastily and poorly put together, but the windows were huge. Somewhere in West Sussex stood a greenhouse with many missing panes which had been relocated here to this wall and that. The often uncooperative English sun shone bright today. And my room and my bed were filled with light. We ate in the canteen or in the main house's kitchen. I sat in my small office reading and writing dispatches while Jane either led an evening class or translated technical bulletins. Every night we unraveled one or two Egyptian codes. American troops were everywhere in the countryside, conducting map reading exercises or mock battles or just moving from one temporary group of tents to another. We often had to turn them away from our narrow lane and tell them they couldn't just march on through to their destination. American officers often thought they knew the land and their business in England better than the English themselves. That's why I had a guard shack stocked with Thompson submachine guns, complete with the intimidating 100-round drum magazine. When produced and aimed at intruders, they always apologized and backed away. So when I heard a commotion at the gate one day, I assumed it was another one of those incidents. It wasn't until I arrived at the main house later in the evening that I realized it hadn't been. Jane was visibly flustered, a rare sight. She was standing by the kitchen window, holding a cup. I walked up behind her and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What's wrong?" I asked gently. She shook her head. Was it nothing, or was it something she didn't want me to know? Her cup trembled, creating ripples on its surface. I didn't say anything more, just stared at her expectantly. She held out for a while, but she knew I wouldn't give up. It was just an old friend who came to visit. I sent him away. Captain Cowie, I presume? She jumped slightly at my knowledge of his name. I wondered what she thought I did all day. Yes, her gaze fell into her cup. I'm concerned that he was able to find you. Her lip quivered as if she were about to bite it, but it returned to its starting point just as quickly, almost fast enough to hide it, but I had caught her bluff. I didn't push the point I had already won. What did he want? I asked as if I didn't already know. Me, he persisted. She nodded. I said no. I told him to leave and never come back. He won't give up. She nodded again. He has already told his family that you agreed to marry him. How she started, then realized she knew what I did all day. Have you given him any reason to make that claim? Her lip begged to be bitten once more. Of course she had. She hadn't said yes, but she hadn't said no either. Now he wouldn't accept any rejection. He was a peer. And I would bet that Colonel Carmichael would show up at our gate sooner or later. Maybe I could arrange a duel between them. I can't have one of my best trainers distracted at such a crucial time. I want you to deal with this problem. She looked at me with genuine interest. How? Marry me. Our honeymoon was spent at the local pub, enjoying the best pint they had to offer along with some bread and cheese during a long lunch. Then we went back to work. Men and supplies flooded the island, and information was what fueled them. My networks were more valuable than ever to the Allied effort, and we placed demands on them that I couldn't have imagined just a year prior. I put Jane in charge of running 3 networks, including Maelstrom. I was overwhelmed with logistics, meetings, phone calls, and training. Everyone in our compound always seemed to be rushing somewhere. We knew it was going to be big and it was going to happen soon. One morning, my phone rang while I was eating oatmeal and looking at aerial photographs of a railroad bridge near ruin. Hello, David. It's Mickey. Guess what? I just got promoted to captain. I owe it all to you, buddy. Can we meet up and have a drink for old time's sake? I didn't know any Mickey from my old days, but I played along, congratulating whoever it was on their promotion. Can you come to the city? Meet me at that place where you danced with Ska. Tomorrow around 9? A chill ran down my spine, but I managed to stay composed, acting as the old and true friend. When I hung up, I just stared at the phone. Danced with Ska could only be the hotel where I had briefly stayed, the Cumberland, where the woman known to me as Chodakowska had shattered my innocence and ended my army career. I grabbed my Colt and a box of bullets and rushed to the train station. July 1943, the man who called himself Mickey was dressed in the uniform of a U.S. Army captain. His clothes looked appropriately worn and creased. The bars on his uniform appeared new. I knew this game. Our operation had several individuals whose job was to create clothing that our agents could wear into their areas of operation without raising suspicion. We often met with recent immigrants from Europe and purchased their old clothes at a fair price for our agents to use. Our team of tailors then modified the authentic garments as needed. I highly doubted that this Mickey was just a captain. He was obviously from Army intelligence, but he didn't identify himself as such. We had a couple pints at the hotel bar, then took a stroll through Hyde Park. In a secluded gazebo by the lake, he showed me a letter signed by Eisenhower, whose signature meant nothing to me, and another signed by Boyce instructing me to fully cooperate with the bearer. I recognized that signature, so I told Mickey, my old buddy, to spill. It was simple, really. Mickey, Ike, and their associates wanted me to come up with ways to convince the Germans that the Allies were planning to land near Calais. Maelstrom and the two other networks operating in Normandy were to feed the enemy false information to make them believe that the real landings weren't happening in Normandy. It was simple, except that this request confirmed that the landing crafts were indeed heading towards Normandy. This was the golden information that needed to be protected at all costs. Now that I knew, my team would soon know. That made us all targets. Targets for Nazi counterintelligence and targets for Allied suspicion of our loyalties. The risks of handling that information were immense. No wonder the fictional Mickey was invented. It was simple, except that we were asking my networks to expose themselves to the enemy to divert their attention. Attention we had worked so hard to avoid. It was a dangerous game. I had a moment of fear for my dear Clefautis, but I imagined what she would say to my fears. It would be something along the lines of put your stupid worries away and act like a man. Mickey looked at me strangely when I smiled and assured him we would get the job done. March 1944, my team came up with various clever ways to divert German attention from Normandy to Calais. Mickey visited the camp a few times to give us ideas and oversee our progress. His real name turned out to be Colonel Robert Devers. I kept calling him Mickey and didn't salute him. Jane informed me that her mother, who had initially disapproved of our marriage, had come to accept us. Her attitude had changed due to her recent diagnosis with a serious illness for which she was receiving treatment in London. When Jane had to visit her mother at the hospital, I couldn't bring myself to tell her that she couldn't go. One morning, I sat down to make a list of tasks and came up with a brilliant idea for a training exercise. I wrote down Stella and Bingham followed Jane. Not long after, the two trainee agents were in my office. My wife is traveling to London by train today. I checked the time. On the 10:05. I want you two to follow her. She is going to St. Bartholomew's to be with her mother, who is receiving treatment for an illness. Your assignment is to follow her, take pictures of the two of them, and provide me with a detailed report of her movements. Bingham, a short man with deep-set eyes, shook his head. Sounds easy. It won't be, I replied. She was trained here, remember. She knows how to spot someone following her. Your only advantage is that she won't be expecting it. Her mind may be on her mother. Mine would be, Stella said wistfully. It seems rather mean of us. No, love, Bingham said. She'll never know we're there. The next day, I took a group into the wetlands and we detonated an old bridge abutment with some powerful explosives. The feeling of releasing that intense, destructive energy was incredible. My only disappointment was that there weren't more structures nearby that we could blow up. When I returned to camp and washed off the dirt from the English countryside, I made my way to my office. On the way, I thought I caught sight of Stella turning the corner, but I brushed it off as a coincidence. Bingham and Stella would report back to me as soon as they returned. I had a sinking feeling as I looked at my desk and saw a large, unaddressed envelope. Anxiety rose in my gut as I opened it, revealing the contents a set of perfectly captured photographs. I understood why my agents hadn't come to me directly. In the photos, Jane and James Griffiths White walked together down a shady sidewalk, arm in arm. Innocent enough. Childhood friends, perhaps. But then the next shot showed them hugging. It appeared to be in the foyer of a fancy hotel. In the following photo, James was signing the register while Jane clung to him. Beneath the developed photographs was a report. I only needed to skim it to have the last bit of comfort in my world shattered. Jane had left the hotel that morning. I paced the room, holding the evidence, torn between the realization that this was bound to happen and the primal urge to grab my gun. I stopped myself, picked up the phone, and asked to be connected to Monseth House. I waited for the line to connect, for someone to lift the receiver at the other end, and then I requested the presence of Her Grace. Hello, she said forcefully, communicating irritation and dominance in a single tone. Your Grace, I said, managing to keep my voice steady. This is David Voigt. I'm calling to inquire about your health. I heard a sharp intake of breath that seemed to say, you impudent man. I don't know why you're calling me. I certainly won't discuss personal matters so you're not suffering from an illness. I expected her to slam the receiver down, but she had manners of steel. What on earth are you talking about? Who am I speaking to? I asked, a power move to reassert my position. She knew exactly who I was. Your son-in-law. She sputtered, a sound that probably hadn't been heard in Monseth House for a while. "I don't know what game you're playing, sir, but I won't participate." And then she hung up. I gently placed the receiver back down and sat down, waiting. She opened the door just as the sun was setting. That door, always sticking, a perpetual flaw. The sun setting behind the clouds, hidden away. She knew, as soon as she saw me sitting there quietly, not behind my desk or engrossed in work. Just sitting. When was the last time I simply sat? For how long? I asked in a hushed voice. Her eyes locked with mine, unapologetic. Since we were in school. I didn't need to ask how often. As often as possible. At parties, hotels, and grand estates. I had only one question. That night? Finally, a hint of shame. She knew which night, and she nodded. I didn't need to ask why. I didn't want to know why. I didn't even care why. When it became clear to her that my part of the conversation was over, she said, "I thought you would understand." I stared at the woman who turned out to be a better agent than I could have imagined. Unfortunately, she was a double agent. Understand? Am I supposed to understand that the promises you made to me before God were something else? Something more flexible, less binding? Because my interpretation of those vows was obviously very different from yours. She shrugged, a movement that showed I had misunderstood her intentions. Underneath that, there was a hint of suggestion that it was my fault for being American, ignorant, and closed-minded, making a fuss about trivial things like vows. "He knows you're married," I said, more as a statement than a question. Her eyes flickered, confirming what I suspected. I took a deep breath. I need to have a conversation with... I couldn't bring myself to say his name. Fear crept into her expression. "No," she said. You can't." "I most certainly can." "No, he's gone." "Gone?" "He enlisted. He must be in France by now." I was on my feet. "What the hell do you mean?" She wrung her hands, a genuine, anxious gesture. It wasn't intentional, but a display of deep worry and embarrassment, ingrained in us from our primitive ancestors. "He's jealous of you. Jealous of what you've accomplished." "You told him what I do." My control slipped and I shouted. She nodded. I never thought he would." "Who is his contact?" "A man named Mayberry." I chuckled, which only made her angrier. "David." She snapped. "Sorry, love. I was just thinking about how I won't have the love of his company anymore." Mayberry didn't even bother changing his cover name. Concern and question filled her face. "He'll be dead within a week," I said coldly. "The Abwehr will sniff him out as soon as he sets foot on French soil." She let out a sharp squeak of recognition. April 1944, I slept on my cot while Jane slept in our spacious bed in the old house. We only talked about training and never touched each other. After a few days of that, I found her sitting on my cot in the darkness. "No, Bout," I said and held the door open. "David, being with you makes me feel things that he never. Please." "No, Anne." She flinched at the use of her real name. It seemed like I had hurt her more by saying it than by slapping her. "After the war is over, then we can decide where we go from here. Until then, we need to focus on our duties." She nodded apologetically and stood up. As she walked out the door, she whispered, "I'm sorry, David." The next morning, the overnight radio operator sent a messenger to find me. We had lost contact with Maelstrom. All that day and the next, we tried to reach the 3 agents. There was no outside help, no one to call, no neighbors to rely on. Silence. When a lone agent goes silent, then it could mean the radio is broken, or they had to move to avoid enemy detection. In the worst-case scenario, they made a mistake, or the enemy captured them before they could escape. In such cases, they would be interrogated and executed if they were fortunate. Clafoutis didn't make contact. The other 2 agents in the network didn't make contact. My worst fear was becoming more likely. When an entire network goes silent, it's called a roll-up. It means they were exposed and systematically caught, ensuring none of them would alert the others to escape. They were rolled up like an old carpet, ready for disposal. The first thing I did was send for Jane. Maelstrom was her network, but the young wren who went to fetch her from the main house reported that she couldn't be found. I went to look and saw that her suitcase and the Hillman were both gone. 2 days of frantic searching yielded no results. I stood in our empty bedroom, the quiet surrounding me. I had questioned Jane's loyalty to me, but her loyalty to duty had always been unwavering. Where had she gone? Finally, the intelligence part of my brain kicked in. "Damn it!" I exclaimed and ran out of the room. I found the hillman hidden in a gap in the hedge on a small lane, half a mile from the RAF base outside Wadhurst. I parked my Jeep and searched the car. In the back, I found Jane's case filled with clothes and shoes. It seemed like she had prepared different disguises. With my identification card, I gained access to the base and checked the officers' club and the barracks. Eventually, I spotted the man I was looking for kneeling under one of the Lysander planes on the grass. He looked up and raised a hand as I approached. "Hey, Voight, what brings you here?" I showed him a photo of Jane taken on our honeymoon. She was smiling, light and joyous. He examined the picture and handed it back to me. According to protocol, he should have drawn his revolver and taken me to the base commander for asking unauthorized questions. "My wife," I said. He muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't make out if it was a curse or a prayer. He stood up and faced me. "I took her across last night." "Where?" He hesitated, looking uncomfortable. He didn't want to give too much away. "Dro. Simple mission." "Simple," he said. Every time he flew over France with an operative in disguise or a soldier with explosives and weapons, it was a dangerous assignment. He risked his life almost every night and called it simple. The strange thing was, she wanted me to put her in around Rennes instead. But that's not how things are done, you know. She eventually gave up trying to convince me, though. He shook his head. "So you put her in at Drox?" He nodded. "The usual equipment, as far as I could tell. An old case and a radio. A disguise and shoes." I pondered for a moment. "Did you get enough rest?" He looked at me knowingly. "Tonight?" He wasn't pleased about it. I placed the picture of Jane back into my wallet. "Tonight." Baumann didn't flinch when the Armée de l'Armistice sergeant approached him on the street. He had a great poker face. If poker were a thing in the Third Reich, he recognized me immediately. His ability to stay alert and seem indifferent were necessary skills to survive in the paranoid prison state that Germany had become. He had his own reasons to be paranoid, as he was actively committing treason against his homeland. I saluted him politely, as a good but not too loyal Vichy France citizen would. He returned the salute, his coldness matching the seriousness of our positions, then motioned for me to follow him to the Abwehr building. We entered a small office and he gestured for me to sit. I handed him the photo. He glanced at it and nodded. She was inside. "Really well done," he said with genuine admiration in his voice. "If she had just stayed in Drox. She claims to be here for her brother. She asked too many questions to too many people." I refrained from asking my questions. "We have her brother as well. He wasn't as skilled." Again, I didn't ask. He gave them up easily. One of the men, the younger one, was shot while trying to escape. The other man jumped from a rooftop. He could tell by my demeanor that I was holding myself together with all my strength. The woman, the red-headed woman, was captured alive. I closed my eyes. I no longer cared what he thought. She played her role until the end. "Wait, hold on. So we got nothing out of your entire network, and the remaining one is worthless." It took me less than a minute with him to see that. "Why do you send such men?" Shaking his head, my voice sounding distant, I asked, "What about this woman?" I tapped the photo. I can tell she knows a lot. Our gazes locked. Finally, he said, "If I give you what you want, you'll give me what I want." I nodded, waiting for him to say it. "When the time comes, you'll use your network to help me." I nodded again. I didn't have a choice. If he subjected Jane to the horrors of the Abwehr, she would reveal far too much. He held all the cards in this deadly game that wasn't poker. I excused myself and slipped out the back door into an overgrown garden where I couldn't be seen. I gazed up at the sky. Patches of vibrant green peeked through the red-tinged clouds. My eyes welled up with tears. My lips moved silently. "I'm sorry, Maura. I am so sorry." After I revealed myself to Jane, Baumann drove us to a farmhouse in the forest. In the fading twilight, he parked outside the farmhouse surrounded by trees, with open fields beyond. He led us into the large front room. Jane let out a gasp. Tied to one of the ancient tree trunks that supported the ceiling beams was a man, blindfolded, gagged and covered in blood, but still clearly James Griffith's White, 14th in line for the English throne and still alive, and therefore valuable. She tried to rush to her lover, but Baumann grabbed her and forcefully placed her in a wooden chair. "Your brother?" he asked in a way that made it clear he didn't believe her story. She nodded, panting, her frightened eyes fixed on the bound figure. He had lost a lot of blood, but he was still breathing. Somewhere in another room, a clock ticked. Bauman looked at his watch, then out the window. No moon tonight. Madame Guix, I have a problem. There are saboteurs here in Côtes d'Armor, and I believe you know who they are. Here's my proposition to you. If you can tell us their names, then I'll let you and your brother go. If you can't, then I'll shoot your brother and tell my superiors that the problem is solved. Jane cried softly. Tears streamed down her cheeks without her making a sound. Bauman pulled out a Walther P-38 and aimed it at James' head, looking at Jane, Madam. She sobbed. James groaned into his gag. He pulled the trigger, slightly adjusting the angle of the barrel. A near miss. The sound filled the room as if a bell had been struck with a hammer. Jane screamed. Madame Bauman aimed the gun again, this time accurately. Jane broke. He. She pointed a trembling finger at me. He's an American. The barrel of the Walther shifted to point at my heart. Guilt overwhelmed Jane's face. Then hope flickered in her eyes. She couldn't meet my gaze. I thought you were Canadian, Bauman said, confusion on Jane's face. On my mother's side. Bauman laughed and put his gun away. Jane practically collapsed with relief as the situation became clear. Oh, David, she cried, can we go home? But she couldn't help but glance at the prisoner. She had told James about Maelstrom. Pillow talk that had led to the deaths of at least 3 invaluable agents. Her carelessness would cost countless lives, both British and American. Just minutes ago, she had been willing to sacrifice my life. She had chosen her brother's life over her husband's. Yes, I lied. I looked at Bauman. He looked at me. He nodded slightly. I walked out the door without looking back. No moon. I started running toward the open fields. My feet thudded against the ground and my heartbeat pounded in my ears, but I imagined I could hear the faint roar of 9 cylinders. At the first gunshot, I stumbled. My face slid painfully along the stubbled dirt, and I lay there, mourning for 3 beats. Another shot. I got up and kept running. The Lysander was just rolling to a stop. The pilot had saved countless agents. Some of them had likely shed tears. Epilogue, February 12, 1996, London. I look past my wife and out at the London twilight. 12 stories below, the streetlights flicker on as darkness descends and the winter day fades away. It had been bitterly cold here, but we escaped most of it by napping and trying to adjust to the time change. 5 hours driving from Brooklyn, Maine to Boston. 7 hours in the air from Boston to London, and another 5 hours adjusting our internal clocks. After such a journey, I feel every bit as old as I am. Odd. I am old, but the woman standing by the window still looks as young as ever. She tells me it's because my vision is fading along with her body, and that's why I always see her as she was. I humor her, but she's wrong. I have good glasses. I see her exactly as she is, and I still love her deeply and desire her passionately. 22 May 1945, London. I was, 27, 28? I could not do the math at the moment. I had been an Army cadet. I had been an Army officer. I had been a boat builder, a carpenter, a sailor, a wild blueberry picker, a potato sorter. I had shot men and tossed their bodies into the English Channel. I had been a spy master, a spy, an infiltrator. All those things, and I had never learned to drink the hard stuff. Beer and wine for me, please. Any form of alcohol more concentrated than those just burned my passages. And yet here I was, in the shadowy back booths of the king's own heart, with a bottle of something called White Horse in front of me, and a glass to the side. Glass? Forget it. I was drinking from the bottle. It was supposedly a cheap whiskey, but it worked the same as the expensive stuff. It tasted like varnish smelled with an old apple thrown in. Not that I had any taste left. The day after VE Day, I drove the Hillman to London and parked it illegally. Left the keys in it. I took a room at the Langham, walked across the street to this pub, and began to systematically sample every bottle of gin, vodka, whiskey, and rum they had in stock. I settled on the horse and initiated my plan to get and stay incredibly drunk until when? I had no clue. Maybe until the crowds on the streets and in the park stopped celebrating. Every darn cheer and song was like nails on a chalkboard. Maybe until I forget my name and then my recent past and then the whole rest of my darn life. I am like the Hillman, wherever it is now. I am parked without a care, keys in me, waiting for the next driver. The problem was, and I did not know this, not being much of a drinker up until 2 weeks ago, that drunk you remember more, not less. And losing consciousness just delayed the next round of memories. Every day I had contemplated buying a book to read, something to distract me from my own darn thoughts, until I became incapable of walking. Every day I paid one of the barmen to help me back to the hotel at last call and just never got around to getting to a bookstore. There were plenty of newspapers in the pub, but I would not read news. I was looking up at a print of a dyspeptic Henry VIII and a figure came into my field of vision. I waved it away, as my bottle still had several fingers left in it. The figure did not go away. It sat in the bench opposite. "Hello," David Boyce said. He motioned to the barman, who brought him an empty glass. Boyce poured from my bottle and sipped. "Interesting. Can't remember the last time I tasted this one." I kept my head turned away. Boyce reminded me of the camp, and the camp reminded me of... I kept my head turned. I reached for the bottle, but Boyce had a firm grip and would not relinquish it. "Let's take a walk," he said. I went to shake my head. It was about the last thing I wanted to do. But Boyce, who still looked like a disheveled solicitor, always got what he wanted. We walked down the street to the park. He walked. I kind of leaned on him as he did so. Luckily, the enthusiasm of victory was proving transient. The park was quiet. Probably everyone was now worried about the war with Japan. Boyce talked the whole time. About the weather, about the great soccer match between England and France he had attended in 1933, about the new Zippo lighter he had purchased, about his wife's obsession with tea roses, about fertilizers for said roses, about I realized I was sober, or close enough. I stopped walking. "What do you want?" He turned to me. What should I expect? Still breathing, I shrugged. He could not have known of the times in the last fortnight I had regarded my colt with some odd feeling akin to longing. Wondering if numbness in a featureless unknown would be better than the memories that came relentlessly around and around like Dorsey on a gramophone. We watched a duck mother leading 5 freshly feathered offspring to the water. Fancy a position? He was referring to the not very much a secret in the intelligence community that he was moving to MI6, high up in the building. No thanks. I would like to never have to harm another person if I can avoid it. He nodded the way my father used to nod, with patience. The offer will stay open. Come see me if you change your mind. He took out a small white envelope from his pocket and passed it to me. This came for you. Through channels that tell me it is authentic. On the outside was written in a fancy feminine hand, David. 23 May 1945, London. The address was in Bromley, an apartment over a tobacco shop. I walked up and tapped on the door. "Hello, David," she said. Then her eyes found the card I was gripping. "I am sorry. I suspected it would be the only sure way to lead you here." Inside the card was written the address. Below that, one word, Clafoutis. It was an incredibly thin slice, but it was. And now it was not. I knew it could not be. I stood deflated, emptied for what felt like surely the last time. Please God, the last time? Her face fell. She did not apologize. Shodakowska took my elbow and led me inside. I collapsed onto a couch. She pulled up a chair and sat close. Leaned forward. We sat and breathed for a while. My breathing slowly calmed. "My name is Elżbieta." I nodded dumbly. "I needed to see you." "I needed for you to see on cue." A boy entered the room. He was dragging a toy truck by a long string. He looked at me, his young face innocent and curious, then spoke rapidly and polished to Elżbieta. He had her lips, but his eyes and nose and ears, even the shape of his head. I tore my gaze away from him and stared at Elżbieta. She had moisture brimming in her eyes but would not meet mine. I nodded my understanding. "When I met you, I knew that you would never hurt me. I was attracted to you in a way I had not been attracted to a man before." Is that a silly thing to say? No, absolutely not. She seemed greatly appreciative of my response. She wiped her eyes. When she started missing her period, she thought nothing of it. The damage had caused her to become quite irregular, and it was 3 months before she consulted a doctor and got confirmation. "I wanted to tell you, but I didn't want to distract you." "What could you have done anyway?" "No, I kept it to myself. Besides, the doctor told me the chances were not good that I could even carry the baby all the way. My womb had healed somehow, but it was weak. The scars, her reproductive organs managed to stay in one piece until the birth. As her water broke, the contractions tore apart the tenuous connections inside her. The scars opened. The baby came out healthy, but Elżbieta needed extensive surgeries to save her life. One miracle baby. There would be no more. She named him Dawid Voigt. She fetched the birth certificate and proudly showed me. My battered brain wondered if you got a JR, or if all the names had to match, or if there were even rules for that kind of thing. Dawid came over to us, and he pointed to his truck. Ford, he said solemnly. Elżbieta smiled down at him. I wanted him to meet you before you her voice caught, before you returned to America. I looked at the kid's serious little face, the eyes that matched the ones I had seen in photographs of me as a child, the nose and ears, even the shape of his head. My world pivoted again, just got lifted right up and set down 90 degrees from what had been north moments before. Later I would express it through words, through actions. I felt pressure and looked down. My son had his own idea of a hug. His arms were wrapped around his mother's legs. His hands reached just far enough beyond them to grab onto my legs. 13th February 1996, London, the West Cloister of Westminster Abbey, is a long, quiet, narrow space of stone floor, stone columns, and stone arches, built to give monks a place to sit and copy manuscripts or read scripture in natural light. They would talk there, pace and contemplate, or just take a break from the whatever were the stresses of a monk's life, in ones and twos and threes. It was not designed to host meetings. It definitely was not designed to comfortably accommodate the 100 or so folding chairs arranged today in tight rows facing the inner wall, where a large blue cloth covers a part of the stone. The chairs had slowly filled as the start time approached, so I sent the grandchildren to watch from the wings and free seats for their elders. The Voigt family is here in force. Myself and Els and Dawid and his wife. Their 3 boys and 1 daughter, all with their spouses. 6 teens, 4 toddlers, and 1 baby bump between them. They had all arranged time to come after I made it clear to them it was important to me and LS. I have a family dinner planned tonight in a private room, and after the meal the younger children will go off with a nanny. My wife and I will then tell them the story of our lives. Some of them know some of the events, but tonight it will be time to put an end to all secrets. The politicians finish their remarks and the Queen Mother shuffles to the wall. The crowd is quiet. I don't recognize any faces, which as a former intelligence agent makes me happy, but as an old man makes me melancholy. Her Majesty pulls a cord and the sheet drops. Underneath is a simple marble plaque of a modest size befitting an organization which always endeavored to shy from notice. It reads Special Operations Executive in memory of the members of all nationalities of SOE, who sustained the spirit of resistance and gave their lives for the liberation of the occupied countries. 1940 to 1945, there are 3,000 and more notables buried in the abbey, in crypts, in tombs, under the floor. There are no bodies to be laid under this stone. They are lost in France, or Germany, or in the ocean waters. Maurice Plowman and John Trevor of the Maelstrom Network. James Griffiths White. Lady Anne Jennings. Moira Haining. Sometime later, the kids are sent to the hotel in Texas. The news media fled in their vans to more contemporary news. The cloister is quiet and cold. Only the ghosts remain to keep us company. Elżbieta and I stand in front of the memorial, holding hands. It was so, she says quietly, reaching out with her free hand to touch the carved words. We were so young we did what needed to be done, I reply softly. The ghosts must keep resting. The best way we knew how if we had it all to do again, she whispers. Our hands tighten together.